Welcome back, guys. In this video, we will be actually doing factoring. So I know I talked about it a lot in the first video, and then we didn't actually do any factoring, but I promise you we will do factoring in this video. So remember, GCF, difference of squares, Xbox are our most common types of factoring. But go ahead and have your factoring book or your factoring notes close by so that you can look up other types if you need to. All right, so here again, I have a single fraction, but this time I have subtraction problems, right? The numerator and the denominator are both subtracting problems. So my first instinct has to be I need to factor these. You cannot just cancel out the pieces of an adding or subtracting problem. So like I can't cancel out the x squares, I can't cancel out the 8s. That's not how this works. And actually, if you do just cancel without factoring on that type of problem, I can't even give partial credit on like a quiz or a test. You would just get a 0 for that problem. So if you are not factoring, you are getting no credit on these problems. So really make sure that you practice your factoring. Let's see, for the numerator and actually the denominator as well, both of those have a GCF. So I'll start, the numerator has a GCF of 4 and x. So both of the terms are divisible by 4 and they both have an x. And then in my denominator, I have a GCF of just the number 2. I don't have a GCF of x because the 8 does not have an x. Now, once you're done factoring, if you still have a variable with an exponent on it, you can probably factor that again. So in my numerator, I cannot factor anymore because it's just a letter x. But in my denominator, I do have an x squared, and so I should try to factor a second time. This is a binomial, so it's probably a difference of squares. And it is, because I know the square root of x squared, I know the square root of 4, and there's a minus sign in the middle. So I'm going to go ahead and factor this again. And then here is my fully factored fraction. Now, once you are done factoring, and before you start canceling, we need to find our restrictions, just like we did in our first video. So the restrictions come from the denominator, because remember, we don't want the denominator to equal 0. And so I'm going to look at my denominator. And anywhere that I see a letter X, I will have a restriction. So this front number 2, the GCF of 2, that will not give me a restriction because there's no variable with it. I don't have to worry about this equaling 0 because it's literally the number 2. It's never going to equal 0. So I'm just going to take my 2 parentheses, and that's where I'm going to get my restrictions. And so I will end up with 2 restrictions since I have the letter X written twice. And we basically just set them both not equal to 0, and then we solve. So x plus 2 can't be 0, x minus 2 can't be 0, and then we solve each of those. And so my 2 restrictions are that x cannot be negative 2, and x cannot be positive 2. Remember, that means if x is positive 2, and I plug that into my denominator right here, I'm going to get 2 minus 2, which is 0. And 0 times anything is 0, and the whole thing turns into a 0. So we're trying to find numbers that would make the denominator a 0, and then we're saying that those are bad numbers. Don't use them. After you've done writing your restrictions, then you can simplify your fraction. In this problem, I have 2 parentheses that are 100% identical, the x minus 2 and the x minus 2. Please notice how I crossed off the entire parentheses. I did not cross off the x's and the minus 2's. It's all or nothing, the whole thing or none of it at all. Now, there's one other thing that I can simplify. I have this 4 up here, and it is not trapped in parentheses. So it is allowed to cancel out with something else that is not trapped in parentheses. So it can't cancel with this 2 because this 2 is trapped, but it can cancel with this outside 2. So outside numbers can simplify, and so I can simplify my 4 and my 2. And then I have this. Now notice that I kept the bottom in parentheses, and the reason why I did that was to try to make sure that I did not accidentally try to simplify it when I'm not allowed to. So I know that this is a 2 and that's a 2, and I know this is an x and that's an x. But because the bottom is an adding problem, it is surrounded by parentheses, and so it can only cancel with another adding problem. And we don't want to accidentally reduce things that are not allowed to simplify. So that's it. This is my final answer. I cannot cross off anything else. And so I do highly suggest keeping your adding and subtracting problems in parentheses. I also do want you to have your final answer in fully factored form. So if it is multiple parentheses or something like that, keep it like that. Don't multiply it out. Why don't you guys try this one really quick before we leave for today, just to make sure that you're doing it correctly before you try your homework. All right, let's see how you did. So here I factored out my GCFs. Now I talked about this in the first video. If you have a subtraction problem with the same numbers, same letters, but in the wrong order, you can factor out a negative sign and then you can switch the order around. Now it doesn't matter which one you factor out the negative sign from. I like to factor it out from the one that where the X is second because that doesn't look normal to me. So I'm going to go ahead and take a negative out of the bottom. And then that will allow me to switch this order around. Okay. So by making this a negative X to the fourth, I can now write this as X minus 4 instead, which will allow me to cancel these parentheses. If I didn't do that, I couldn't cancel the parentheses. Here are my restrictions, 0 from my GCF, which was a letter X, and then 4 from my parentheses. And now I can simplify. And my final answer is negative 1 over X squared. The negative sign, it does not matter where you put it, but you do need a negative sign somewhere in your answer. All right, guys, that concludes today's videos.